Hello,
We're back again.
he's Shabazz.
He's Pete Marshall, and this is Cryptech UK.
Yep.
Just before we begin, I just wanted to say, at the risk of being called woke, I just wanted to give a bit of a content warning of what we're about to discuss today. Do with that what you will. I've done it now.
Well,
Anyway,
you just to point out, content warning. One of the discussions is around paedophilia, mostly around society's like attitude towards it, as apart from like graphic details. But like, nevertheless, content warning given. And yes, we're now an enemy of Boris Johnson. Be
Yeah.
very afraid.
So even though we've spoiled it, I'll ask you again. What are we talking about today?
Okay. First thing is there was a leak from the Conservative Party, and basically and to some degree it's very interesting in the sense that they said the quiet part out loud, and so to some degree like it's absolutely like cookie cutter in terms of how Boris Johnson and all his ministers have been acting, but it's interesting in the sense of how the two things line up. And the other one, there was a Home Office report that talked about how apparently a particular category of criminals, aka paedophiles, actually come from all ethnicities. Shockingly enough, who would have believed it? And so, we thought it was worth interest. It was of interest to talk about kind of the social context of that somewhat.
Yeah. White men do crime too. Wow.
I know that's going to be shocking.
Yeah. And let's not leave women out of this. I'm sure white women do crime too.
You wouldn't
Yeah.
believe what they get up to, Shabazz.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think we should start with the definition of woke first.
I mean, in part, I think this is a bit of a red herring in the sense that the Google definition of woke, the useful one, is alert to injustice in society, especially racism. Now, the problem with that is like, if you're a trans activist, very few trans activists wouldn't be regarded as woke, and yet they're not doing like anti-racism work. If you look, there's so basically that so basically like I think the major issues for me is around it's specifically millennial. So wokeness is kind of a fairly it's kind of how millennials interact with politics and justice. So you could probably go a bit further into Generation X and things like that, but in that sense, it's so yes. There's I think honestly like there's many different definitions, and there are kind of activists who are there are left wing millennial activists are generally regarded as the most woke, or who are the owners of woke. Although I would also argue that it's kind of also a fairly like California thing. And there's like crushed avocado toast, which is regarded as being fairly like, and so there's an entire thing about the non-politics of wokeness.
Yeah.
So I think honestly, like going, well, this is so I think honestly to some degree it's a red herring going, well, there's some massive definition that everyone agrees on, and that is like how we can arrange this. Like,
What's the different? It's a pejorative term, though, right?
well, I think people
Never
do.
used in a positive light, right?
I mean, again, I think one of the problems here is it's like quite an American term. I mean, if you were to look at like the epicenter of wokeness, it would definitely be somewhere like California, which honestly in the UK, like you very rarely hear someone regard themselves as woke. Like it's a bit like hipster in the sense in the UK this is, but honestly, like bluntly put, I'm not like you know, I know and care about racism, specifically anti-racism stuff. I know and care about like a whole range of topics. I'm not sure that I've ever called myself woke, and I'm not sure that I would regard like so. Yeah, I think
In
it's
that,
so. I think in the UK is largely like you know.
in that sense, then we have to investigate why we were talking about that. Then
Well, I think the most interesting point here isn't so much who is because I think the interesting point here isn't so much who is calling themselves woke, and it's more who is giving the title of woke. And I think
yeah,
this is where it gets interesting because basically, to go back a bit, the where this comes from is there was a leak from the Conservative Party from from a Northamptonshire branch, I think. We can put this up on. I think we've already put this up on our Twitter account. And basically, it was talking about how, and basically, it was talking about um, like lessons to be learned from the Trump kind of failure to get elected, which is always the best headline to put at the top of these things. Um, and their second, and basically, they were talking about things like and one of their major points that kind of and one of their ones which is very Trumpian is it's better to be wrong at the right time than it is to be right at the wrong time. Another one was
just
like
just for
like
effect, just for effect. Could you repeat that again?
it's better to be wrong at the right time than it is to be right at the wrong time.
Okay.
So it and honestly, there was a couple of lines about one of the things I think they were impressed by. God help us, is Donald Trump's ability to grab headlines without actually doing anything. And like this is a broader notion around triggering the libs, which is just saying mindlessly shocking things, and then thinking you're so smart when other people go, "Oh my God, I'm shocked by that,"
Yeah.
which wow. Yay. Um so yeah, there was a whole bunch of stuff honestly that was but basically one of the things was they talked about this was they talked about how their politics should be anti-woke. And there was and honestly in some ways it's interesting them talking about it because and this is kind of where I was going with I don't think it matters who regards themselves as woke because for example I would honestly this and it because honestly like this because honestly basically who is making the decisions here? It's the right wing, it's the Conservative Party. They have decided that basically apparently rights only matter if they're not woke rights. And as soon as they are woke rights, then immediately like that you have to go somewhere else for those. So and honestly, this has been kind of obvious from the start because honestly, like there was an entire thing earlier on this year about trans people. Like basically, there was a law coming into effect, and there was a whole bunch of policies that would make unisex bathrooms a lot more common. Blah blah blah, normal. Now Boris Johnson just basically body blocked the entire thing and said, "No, this isn't happening." And honestly, it was one of those like, why? Like, honestly, the law had already been passed. In many ways, like, the thing, like, he didn't have to do anything. If he had done nothing, then it would have been fine. And honestly, very few people were complaining. Like, anti trans people were complaining. But apart from that, like, it really wasn't like a massive thing that, like, you know, so, but having said that, apparently, Boris Johnson decided that trans rights are woke rights, and so they don't, and so he's not like allowing them to come into force. So, you know, Sorry, trans people. Um,
Yeah, but I just wanted to say that I think this kind of, you know, uh, especially the idea of putting conflicting messages out there, for example, has been around for a long time. I saw it back in Adam Curtis documentary when he was talking about one of Vladimir Putin's
oh,
advisors,
I
and
think I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, first off, the entire notion around, I mean, Vladimir Putin's one case, and if you look at Timothy Snyder and talk about kind of um, contemporary fascism, and its connections with Putin, which isn't kind of a one-to-one thing,
yeah,
then yes, like and that's and honestly, Russia is one element of this.
yeah,
Um, Another element of this, I would say, another element of this, I would say, is just this wider like culture war phenomena, which again is traditionally like more American, but basically, like this is like essentially like going we have woke culture and non-woke culture, and basically we're just going to scorched earth on anything that we regard as too woke. Because to
yeah,
some degree, if you look at Harry and his marriage and the hell that the son and the male gave his wife, like, and again, if you look at kind of some of the things that they've given the royal family hell for, it's things like eating crushed avocado on toast, you know. And so honestly, and like, why did they choose to go after them? They weren't like, you know, they were fine. I'm not a great supporter of the royal family, and I genuinely don't care. But honestly, like, yeah, it is. She was objectively fine, and yet apparent. And so, in some ways, I think this entire notion of the culture war, um, it's kind of, and honestly, I find it fascinating in the
it's
sense.
partly racism.
Excuse
Partly
me.
racism, I think.
I mean,
Partly
honestly,
racism
like, I.
because his wife isn't white,
I mean, that
you
would
know.
be. I mean, in
So
some ways, I think that that's. I kind of disagree with that in the sense that if you look at Labour, then, or if you look at many of the other things, then actually many of the other things that they hate actually have nothing to do with other ethnic groups. Like crushed avocado on toast. I guess you could say that that's Mexican, but like, how many like do people normally go crazy about tacos? Like, or salsa? Like Doritos and salsa are a fairly unanimous thing in the UK that like you just eat it. So I think that honestly
yeah,
going, well, there's racism here. I get why people say that, but honestly, I'm not sure it's the most like I'm not sure it explains all the facts perfectly as if you hate wokeness, then honestly, basically, basically Prince Harry's wife. Um,
yeah. But what I'm saying, don't mischaracterize what I'm saying though. I said racism was a part of it, not was the only reason. You know, I said it plays an element of it. That's all I'm
I mean,
saying.
if you look at Meghan Merkel, then basically then think about it. She was a non-white, so I'm not saying it had nothing to do with it, but a non-white. She had lived a lot in California. She was an actress, pretty middle class, which honestly is like, bluntly put, it's fairly like hipster slash uh hipster slash woke. Um, you know, I think that if you would just do it, if you were just going, what is, I think that race, I'm not saying it wasn't any of it, but I am somewhat skeptical about whether the reason they chose to about whether the reason this was such a widespread thing as it was because of her. Or was because of that one specific thing. Like, honestly, I would, and honestly, in some ways, I would say that if you look at and just to say, one of the interesting things about this came up in PMQs, and honestly, Keir Starmer did his normal kind of amazingly charismatic and powerful speeches in Parliament. And and I'm more interested though in Boris Johnson's response, because in the end he asked about whether whether Boris Johnson believes what was said in this campaigning thing. And honestly, Boris Johnson's response was, I am more interested in you making any decisions like you didn't in the schools. Now, first off, it's not Keir Starmer's job to make decisions. He's leader of the opposition. In the UK, that means it's his job to ensure the government stays in line and does the best they can for the government, or does the best they can for the people. Anyway, does the best they can for the people. So in the end, it didn't matter. It never mattered whether Keir Starmer actually worked out what the perfect solution was. It's not his job to make decisions. It would be his job if he were it would be his job if he wins the next election. It is not his job.
No,
B,
but
B,
okay, go on.
B, but again, none of that. And so the fact that he just gives the same nonsensical reply and doesn't even bother answering the question basically gets back to this thing that this is not about actually answering questions. This is about making the wrong reply at the right time. This is about, as long as you fill airspace, then it doesn't actually matter with what. And then you've basically just nullified, you've basically just ghosted your opponent, and then you can just walk on and do whatever you want.
Yeah, but can I just say a few things there? First thing I'll say was
Sorry, could you repeat all that? I can't.
And I'm not.
Sorry, Shabazz, can you repeat all of what you just said? I heard none of it.
Okay. I'd say two things. Firstly, I'm not a big fan of the royal family. I just like that clear. But I think at this moment in time, this country is in such a mess. We're gonna need the royal family to bring in some money, basically. At this point, that's all they're being used for. Anyway, that to one side. What was I going to say now? I've actually forgotten what I was going to say, so you carry on.
I mean, just to say, this is part of a larger thing that Steve Bannon talked about. Basically,
that was what I was going to say. Sorry, can I just say this?
Yeah.
The second point was that I think the job of an opposition is to hold the government to account, but to also come up with, what they would do in government if they were in government. And I don't think the opposition is doing that in this case.
I mean, I would say they can. I would say let's say that again, part of the problem is that we have an unbalanced system right now because of this entire situation, and because Boris Johnson and the right wing and the Daily Mail and the Sun just keep on treating this thing so disgracefully. It ends up with a situation in which Keir Starmer can't actually do anything right. And to be fair, many of the people in Labour can't do anything right. So I think that this is so I think honestly I end up slightly responding against that and going, well, I slightly have sympathy with them. I'm not sure whether because let's be perfectly frank, any policy is criticizable, and the only way you know whether it's the right policy is if it's put into action, and then you find out whether it's right. If there's never any chance of it getting put into action, then to some degree you can always come up with a reason why any response could
No, but
conceivably be wrong. So I
you
think
are,
honestly, like I don't take it seriously why that like it's Keir Starmer's job to come up with policies that no one can criticize for any reason, and everyone will just go, oh, "This is the policy that I've been looking for in my dreams."
no, no, no,
Like I
no, no, no. I, and I'm not just having a go at Keir Starmer's party here. I'm saying any opposition party. I just think they're there to present an alternative vision and to hold the government of the day to account. Yeah, and and on those two counts, this opposition is not doing that. You know, that's all I'm saying.
I
And you
I
know, elections are always 4 or 5 years apart. And how else are you meant to get in the public's consciousness other than telling them, year on year what your policy would be? You know, what kind of government you would need, rather than waiting for a 6 week campaign and going, oh, we'll have to come up with this now.
I mean, I mean, real talk. Most people don't listen to don't pay attention to politics for
But,
most of
but
those
that,
4 years,
doesn't mean
and
they
that's
shouldn't
and
do
that's
it though.
fine. That's good. People shouldn't be listening to politics all the time. It's not human. But having said that, it is kind of so. I think to some degree, the fact that we only have so I think to some degree, and honestly, I would say that we shouldn't that honestly us constantly having people in power have very easy time making allies. So therefore, like, of course, if you are a journalist or something, it's easier to criticize the opposition than it is to criticize the government, because why not? And so to some degree, I don't think that Keir Starmer's the best leader ever. I'm not even sure I think he's good, but I do end up thinking in these in the current kind of climate that everyone ends up basically that there is an element in journalism that's being kind of politicized here, and that's kind of my broader point, that I think Keir Starmer's flaws are not being contextualized properly. Like, he's not like the things that he like. There is things to criticize him for. Those things actually relatively rarely get discussed, and mostly what does get discussed is like and mostly what does get discussed is like a couple of really highly like politicizable things that just get expanded beyond any rational belief. The fact that there was a very difficult decision about when to close down schools. Again, what would have been the perfect solution there? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. And Boris Johnson made a wrong response. And then Boris Johnson next time immediately went, "You should have made the response. It's your job to basically tell me as Prime Minister what to do. And the fact that you didn't tell me what to do immediately means that I can basically for the next 6 months, like, spend the next 6 months, like, and um and honestly, this basically makes a laughing stock out of Parliament. Essentially, how is the opposition supposed to do anything like hold the government to account if the government's response, and if the speaker allows the government response to basically be like, essentially, like, what? How are you supposed to, like, if the response just like, you may as well just have a drive-by DJ and just a soundboard in front of the prime minister. Like, this isn't like this isn't debate, and so this is part of, and so that's kind of where I'm getting at this more. I don't think so. And I don't know whether I think about, if I would agree with his vision or not, if I actually like if he was actually in government is a separate topic. But I,
All I'm saying is the other day in the UK, no, I'll say that again. The other day in the UK, there was, in 24 hours, it was reported that there was over 600 people died the other day
mm,
from coronavirus. And now in any other circumstance, 600 people would die because of one thing. You know, the opposition would have been at the government's throat, you know? And
I
there's a lot
mean,
of reasons
real
not,
talk. I mean, real talk. If you
not
like, real talk. If you look at the history of British opposition, like if you go back to like the heydays of Brexit when there was these, like honestly, it was Ed Miliband and David Cameron. If you go, honestly, if you watch any episode of, if you watch any episode of like the comedy programs that I've watched my entire life about politics, then basically the fact that the opposition are pathetic is basically the most common. Like in the end, the opposition basically get characterized as basically one of two things: they're either pathetic or they're smarmy. And in the end, being smarmy is basically 2 minutes away from actually taking office. So that was like Tony Blair. So honestly, like this is what Ed Miliband got his entire time. This, and again, I don't like him, but anyway, but this is, and honestly, if you remember Jeremy Corbyn, like for the 10 minutes they weren't calling him anti-Semitic, they were saying that saying that he was too pathetic. So honestly, like I think that like there are criticisms like. I've lost any sympathy with that as a criticism. As far as I'm concerned, apparently being pathetic is just what you get for being in opposition, which I don't know. Okay, like win elections, I guess, is the only way of not being pathetic. Um, so yeah,
in terms of this woke culture, I don't think it's going anywhere because, for example, if we're saying that the right the right parties deploy this tactic, and just in Europe, I was reading this morning, just in Europe, there's still 30 odd parties, and the leading governments or in opposition having far right parties in charge. So what I'm trying to say is this kind of politics isn't going away anytime soon.
I mean,
Just
I
because you got rid of Trump doesn't
I
mean
mean,
it's
I
going
would
to go
say a
away.
couple of things here. I would say that I'm not sure I regard woke culture as a politics, at least not yet. Like honestly, like there are almost vanishingly few millennials in any serious positions. Like even if you look in the Houses of Parliament, like in terms of like in America, it's considered to be incredibly rare. Like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez would basically be the obvious one, but there's like probably about three, and that's kind of in the Senate and that's in the Senate and the um, Congress and House of Representatives. In Parliament in the UK, maybe a similar amount. Um, honestly, like, and again, this is in Parliament. So if you were to look at leaders of like European countries, maybe one. I think there's an Eastern European dude who's like in his like mid 30s, late 30s. Like, so honestly, when you start talking about like how much power does woke culture have? I mean, this is part of the bullshit thing. It doesn't. It's a way of a very disparate group of people thinking about and talking about what they want. And again, I think the disparate group of people thing is important because in the end, I've spoken to pretty right wing people, like trans people who supported Boris Johnson, actually, who nevertheless wanted unisex bathrooms, which, and they did, and apparently he was perfectly happy, like stepping on their rights if basically they ended up like disagreeing with him. Um, so basically, this is kind of the thing that basically he's just that basically he's forcing a generation of kind of people who have a range of political views to basically push themselves into one position because he's just put scorched earth and just gone, yeah, we're in conservative politics, we do not do that politics. Like that is not a form of free speech that we will in any way support or allow, which I would argue is like that's I think this gets to a problem of like if you go back to Steve Bannon, then one of his major ideas was this notion of like making making
Was he
culture.
was he attacking woke culture?
Yeah. I mean, if you go back to Donald Trump's election, then yeah, then yeah, like, and he was one of the and if you go back to kind of how to kind of his big idea about how he got into politics, basically he was one of the people who worked out how to kind of weaponize internet gaming culture done by generally millennials, and basically weaponize that against feminism, against a whole bunch of kind of woke things. And you know, for a while, just basically YouTube was a cesspit of like of ju- of it basically went from about center right to about like to basically literally fascist, neo-fascist, like. So when you start to and he was one of the major kind of storytellers who slash producers who basically created that as a situation and got a whole bunch of people with money to put their money into various YouTube producers and various people. So, you know, there was networks, so there was groups, so blah 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 blah. So I mean, in the end, in some ways, this kind of war. So in some ways, like, the problem here is isn't isn't necessarily so much as like woke culture is a coherent enough concept in order to be like crushed. And in some ways, like, this millennials as a group, as they get older, will have, you know, by definition, we will have many more members of every parliament and we'll have many more world leaders. The problem really is about ensuring that as soon as possible, the good ideas that millennials have actually get made into policy, and so countries actually get better. And this entirely leads us into the kind of the basic problem of all this of like, apparently many of these right-wing parties aren't interested in making their countries better. They aren't
Yeah,
interested in policy.
and
They aren't interested in like actually using power and ensuring that what using the power that they use actually like takes us takes us the next couple of steps, and then passing the baton. And in the end, like, at some point, if their notion of power at this point is just we can stop you from we can just body block you and stop you from getting what you want, we can basically block your rights, and that is what we can do. That's a notion of government. I mean, I would argue that goes against almost any kind of notion of like European government that has ever worked.
and
So
I think that should bring an end to our first question, which is
um this is about like the misuse of paedophilia as a um kind of discussion point. Yeah, I know, having a massively cheerful episode today. Still,
yeah.
we're not using the C word today. So like
Uh,
um
so we're talking about this in relation to the Home Office report, finally admitting that white people exist and they must do crime also.
just to point
Yeah,
out, it's somewhat interesting that this is that again, going back to how much the conservatism and how much their war on wokeness relates to race. It's interesting that Priti Patel is one of the more kind of right wing people. Um, she is in the UK pretty infamous for her anti-immigration stances and various other things. As you can tell from her name, she's not white English. Um, and honestly, the report that she wrote the foreword for is explicitly about how pedophile grooming gangs is not kind of a Asian thing. Now, again, in some ways, the fact that she's saying something that's obviously true is not in itself like does she shouldn't be applauded for it in some ways. In other ways, I think if we're thinking about okay, so how much is the Conservative Party just driven by racism, and how much is racism just sometimes like a convenient crutch, maybe? Like in terms of distinguishing the two, apparently in this particular context, they could have not published this report. That would have been the more racist response.
Yeah, but it sounds like she's come up with this report and she's doing it. But it sounds to me like I don't know, but it sounds to me like she's reluctantly doing it, but she's doing it nonetheless.
We can over psychologize these things in some ways. I don't know what
Yeah,
her personal feelings are, and to some degree, like it, we're never going to find out.
yeah.
The fact that she was allowed to do it and the fact that she chose to do it, kind of, as far as I'm
But
concerned, they say
but the
something.
thing I wanted to
We can
talk about
argue
is
about what.
how the thing I wanted to talk about is how uh, pedophilia that gets weaponized by the right, by people like Stephen Yaxley Lennon and
Tommy Robinson, for if you know him by his more common name, but yes,
all of those kind of people. And I'm not equating the two together, but I do think they do a similar kind of thing, like stoking up hatred and stuff.
I think I
Another
think
famous person, Nigel Farage,
I
you
think
know.
probably the distinction to be drawn is that Nigel Farage is the upper class version um, of of Tommy Robinson, and
Yeah.
so and so the weaponization of paedophilia generally happens in kind of more working class circles. I mean, if you think about, I mean, probably the most singularly idiotic. Do you remember this? A couple of years ago, there was an article in the Sun that basically the headline, this was front page thing, and they said we have got a list of these paedophiles who haven't been caught, and the police haven't done anything about them. And honestly, it turned out that that this was a list of pediatricians.
Yes, well.
And
We can
basically there
leave that one
was
there, shall
and there
we?
was so much hate mail to these people, and they were just a list of pediatricians who were just in like some city, and they were like, and honestly, they started getting hate mail. They were just like, what on earth is happening? Oh my god.
Oh,
And like honestly, like that wouldn't happen in the Financial Times. And again, partly
yeah.
that's slightly because they like think that they like try and be truthful, but also it's because I think that they don't have the same attitude to what they don't consider like pedophilia to be like a story that they would think is kind of newsworthy.
But this is what links here, I think, in a way, to the previous question, is
Yeah,
that these kind of conspiracy theories kind of get get blown up on the internet, and get kind of get traction and become, and then the mainstream media, in air quotes, picks it up because they've heard people talking about it on Twitter, and therefore it becomes a kind of, oh, we got a finger on the pulse. This is the
I
word
mean,
on the street.
I mean, my reading of the Tommy Robinson thing, and honestly, in some ways, I did my reading of that was more that Tommy Robinson specifically was funded by some um, pretty non-British, and again, that it's there was reports on it. People, and basically he was explicitly going out or mostly online. He was basically bringing together groups of people who, again, mostly if you look at what they were doing, it was mostly around demonstrations and things, which again is a pretty working class way of like approaching politics. If you're Nigel Farage, you wouldn't even consider doing demonstrations. You just
No.
unless there's hundreds of thousands at them.
I can't
So
remember exactly where, but I remember couple of months ago during lockdown, Nigel Farage, Nigel Farage was going to beaches looking for dinkies. Like what? You should be locked down, bro. Not going looking out for dinkies.
I mean, the other way of thinking about that was actually he was wandering a very empty beach. Like it was apparently him and like one person who could use a camera, or maybe he had a stand and he was like timing it or something. So apparently it wasn't like that unsafe. Like I
Yeah,
don't like I'm not sure, like I'm fairly sure he was doing it in the context of like thinking he was being like heroic and like sticking it to the libs, but it was one of those like, dude, you're like the second or that's like the second or third most safe thing that you could do.
yeah.
Like if you want to actually like demonstrate your courage, then like go into then like go into a nightclub, go into a nightclub of like 900 people packed and like start and take a picture of yourself there, and then I'll be like, that's insane. But
Thinking,
like
thinking he
you
was
probably should
James
have been at
Bond in a
home, but
dinky.
like yeah, it could have been worse.
Thinking he
Sorry.
was James Bond in a dinky in a tweed jacket.
Excuse me.
Thinking he was James Bond in a dinky with a tweed jacket on, with a pint in his hand or whatever he's probably got in his hand. Yeah, I just like the way, wasn't he the same guy who in the middle of Brexit was talking about moving to Germany?
No, no, and is almost certainly moving to Germany.
And Stephen Yax in Lennon is also gonna live is living in Spain because apparently it's safe
so
for him to
so
buy.
the next time right wingers start telling you how patriotic they are and start like and start like hugging the flag and everything, then remember that as soon as they fucked up your country sufficiently, they will abandon it and just be like, yeah, we're done here.
Yeah,
We've done our job. I mean,
but
I would just say this. I think like so yeah, I think that there were so I think that I mean, I think that there's an interesting thing around um, paedophilia. I think as a society, we very legitimately revile it because it is horrendous
yeah,
and it should be illegal, and it is. I think that I think that one of the reasons why it's so effective is that it makes us go into kind of what's called effective override. And that's basically, it makes us get very emotional. And so we basically go back to our lizard brain, and so we don't think about kind of, okay, what's the where did this information come from, why could it be wrong, who could, could it be a lie, should I be skeptical, it, and honestly people go, well, who's not against pedophilia? Well, everyone is against pedophilia. Like 98% of the population is. And so going well, on paper, but and so honestly, like there's this sense in which I think people feel safe to be against it, but then as soon as they get as soon as it like, actually gets discussed, you get to this point of like just like you cut, it's very difficult to like go through it with a fine tooth comb and like go through the data. And I think that that this is a very kind of an easy target to be for people to be manipulated by it. And I think that it's a shame because it's genuinely a good impulse. Like I think that people who are like shocked by it should be. It's a good impulse to be shocked by it. It just doesn't end up, it's just that most people who will be trying to push that button in your head will not be doing it for good reasons. And I think so I think that that's kind of half of this. I also have to say, one of the things that endlessly irritates me is that I think, and this kind of goes back to my point about like, I think I'm not sure everyone opposes paedophilia in the way that they should. Actually, and honestly, this is a broader European, American, British thing. That actually, I think that our kind of policies in terms of actually stopping paedophilia are fairly appalling. Like, you wouldn't be wrong in saying that, like, as like I could talk about the UK in like some level of detail. we're not like statistically. If you were to basically go, how much like are these people doing everything they can from a policy perspective? The answer is obviously no, and that's a shame. But I think part of the reason for that is because policy is boring and we don't like doing it. And honestly, and also part of the reason is because right-wing people, especially as we've just been discussing with Boris Johnson, don't really care about policy. And so the problem is that you get into two very different conversations. You get into like, how are we going to not have pedophiles? And then we get into policy discussions. And the problem is those two things should be the same conversation. And they are very, very, very not, because people just think of pedophilia in terms of like the police. And really, the police are probably 30% of the solution at best. So
I would like to say at this point, and I do think it's something that needs to be said, that a lot of abuse actually goes on in the family unit, and
agreed.
and that gets missed because everybody's like fixated on all these other things,
I
and
mean,
like I just feel there's obviously limited resources, and
I mean,
abuse where it's happening kind of gets missed.
I mean, this is kind of where I was kind of going, because I think there's kind of three different elements here. The first element, and again, this applies mostly in the UK, but again, I would probably say that versions of it apply in many other places. First off, generally, and this is a post-Thatcherite, although to be honest with you, anyway, a post-Thatcherite thing mostly in the 60s. Anyway, I'm not going to go beyond that. Um, Basically, there has been a tradition where a good council is a council that does not spend money. And that ends up meaning that actually, in many situations, they would rather not pick up problems, because as soon as you pick up a problem, then that means you have to actually solve it. And as soon as you solve a problem, then that means you have to spend money. And so you end up with and so honestly, like, this is a problem around councils that honestly, generally, they very often don't have the level of expertise and the level of of like dense capacity to actually deal with these things well. And it takes a wide range of services, and it takes like the funding being in exactly the right places at exactly the right times. And honestly, that's just not how councils are designed. So, and again, like there are jokes about kind of the fact that a council is run best, like the best councils like don't have statistics on blah 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 in Yes Minister. It isn't, I'm not talking about a particularly like deep state idea. Like this is, and I think that if you were to go to kind of one of the most vulnerable populations, because you're right that if you're talking about most people, then then yes, most paedophilia happens at home, and or with trusted friends. But if you're looking at the most vulnerable populations, then that's generally around orphanages, and that's generally around that. And honestly, that's a massive issue because like there's almost no like serious discussion of policy around that. If you're talking about these grooming gangs and where they get people, most of them come from those places. It's not, and honestly, like if you read some of the news stories and if you like go through some of the documentation, it's basically we have absolutely appalling policies around procurement. We have appalling policies around how we set standards. We have appalling policies around training. We have appalling policies in terms of like what do we actually think around how do we actually think we're going to get from from the point where they walk through the front door to the point at which they leave and get their first job. Like in the end, that is not so. and how we're keeping and how we're ensuring that this is a happy, normal child all the way through, child, adult, child, teenager, adult, all the way through that. And in the end, that's doable. It just requires thought and money, and it requires a level of actual
One
inspectors
thing
doing
to
their
do.
job and various things. And just to
Yeah,
point out, there's a third group who I will point out here, which kind
okay,
of
go
is
on.
interrelated with the first two, and that's social workers. And again, this is another group who, for various reasons related to the first one, like in the end, councils run social workers in the UK, and in the end, like councils don't particular and neither councils nor anybody else particularly wants to go, okay, let's completely rework this, and let's basically put all our effort into basically because essentially if you're a child at risk, then you should have a children's and family social worker, and it will be their job to assess risk and to think and to basically work out where the best place to put you and to supervise you when you're there. Now, in terms of how many of them there are, in terms of how well paid they are, in terms of how much time they will have per child, in terms of how much information, yada, 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 yada. All of which goes towards the overall quality of how good will your experience be, how much oversight will you have, how much can you trust the person, how much, how fast and how well can they respond to you if you at some point really need their help urgently. In the end, all of those things end up, if the blunt answer to all of those things is like, how much do they get paid? Not much. How much training do they get? Well, I mean, they get a degree and they get various other things, but bluntly put, you know, meh. If the how much time do they get? It's not much. And how much information do they get? It's whatever you tell them in the meeting. In many of these situations, the answer again there is like, so you end up with a situation where actually everyone in the loop is equally badly served by the system, and then everyone and honestly, this applies to what you were talking about with in families, because yeah, police aren't supposed to work in the home. You don't normally see police wandering around your home like making sure things are going fine. So how would they know? So so
Yeah,
how would they know? And that comes, and so it's social workers jobs. And if social workers, like, again, all of the above kind of applies, then we kind of end up with a problem.
yeah,
So, but in the end, I would argue, if you care about pedophilia and you care about like pedophiles having as hard a life as possible, then all of those things should be a very, like, the quality of all of those things should be a very grave amount of like interest to you. But apparently, like, Tommy Robinson, they have no interest whatsoever. So
and I would like to say that, you know, again, I would like to reiterate that this is a serious problem, and a lot of abuse does happen in the family home, and people need to get. I know it's an uncomfortable truth, but it is an actual truth, and
yeah,
policymakers need to actually grapple with the problem, and we could, as a society we get fixated on lots of things around the edges. Nobody actually wants to do the hard work and making policy and
I
putting
mean,
in the resources. You know? And
partly
it's
this is
really
a social
difficult.
technology problem as well. I think if tomorrow,
Yeah,
like, if tomorrow Bill Gates could come up with a gadget that could basically like expunge all pedophilia somehow, then basically we would be perfectly prepared to put billions of pounds into it, and basically buy one for every child and be like, this is it, we've solved the problem. But as soon as
yeah,
you
but
go, okay, what we need is social technology, what we need is systems, what we need is good employ what we need is a council that that spends its money wisely and competently. What we need is,
yeah,
or spends large amounts of money wisely and competently. What we need is social workers who aren't overworked and have like plenty of colleagues. And what we need is like orphanages who are run by people who care and who actually have enough, and have enough time to care, and what we need is schools who understand exactly what it is that they need to be doing in all of this. And we need networks of after school clubs in which they can actually, be normal children. And this is and so if we're not, and honestly, so if that's what so that's probably a lot cheaper than the Bill Gates solution. But in
Yeah,
the end, apparently,
you just made a Freudian slip there by mentioning Bill Gates, and in the far reaches of the internet, Bill Gates is blamed for a lot of paedophilia.
yes.
You know, so that just shows you the scale of the problem.
I mean, it's not quite. I mean, honestly, it's not quite as George Soros is apparently one of the, and Hillary Clinton are apparently the worst.
Yeah, he goes into people's houses and does it.
Bill Gates, I think, is too. Bill Gates, yeah, I think they regard him as being too nerdy and not
Yeah,
smoking enough weed, which honestly
yeah,
is a somewhat fascinating conversation of like how much the right are, how much the right actually have taken up a whole load of habits of the of kind of woke culture and stuff like that. But
yeah.
that's its own separate thing.
And I just wanted to say one more thing in closing was the fact that it's just refreshing that it's acknowledged that this abuse problem is a wider cultural problem of all races. You know, it's just
I
refreshing to hear that acknowledged.
I mean, I think it was always obvious. It's nice to hear it from the government, though.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean,
Uh, Go on. Is there anything else you want to say before we end?
no, I'm good.
That's a note from me as well. Bye.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.